Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
I'm Sandra, and I'm just the professional your small business was looking for. But you didn't hire me because you didn't use LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn has professionals you can't find anywhere else, including those who aren't actively looking for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role, like me.
In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you'll miss out on great candidates like Sandra. Start hiring professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Since 2013, Bombas has donated over 100 million socks, underwear, and T-shirts to those facing homelessness. If we counted those on air, this ad would last over 1,157 days. But if we counted the time it takes to make a donation possible, it would take just a few clicks. Because every time you make a purchase, Bombas donates an item to someone who needs it.
Go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com/ACAST, code ACAST.
Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod. Today we're going to do something a touch different. Very, very occasionally, a piece of work passes across my desk that massively impresses me. Normally that's because it's a piece of scholarship that's opened my eyes or it's particularly well done. Very, very rarely a novel passes across my desk that makes me sit back and go, wow. And that is the focus of what we're going to be looking at today. In fairness, when this, it was a very, very early version of what's become a very hotly anticipated book. When the text dropped on my desk, I probably should have anticipated that it would be as good as it was, because it's fair to say that the author of it knows their way around a typewriter. They have a number of Sunday Times bestsellers. They've published in more than 10 companies, including the UK, US, Italy, Spain, Greece, Russia, and the Netherlands. They are the author of very much enjoyed series, including the Lionheart series, the Clash of Empires series, the Eagles of Rome series. If you haven't worked it out yet, folks, I am joined by Ben Kane. He's written a book called Napoleon's Spy, which looks at the Moscow campaign, which I thought was a pretty ballsy move, I have to say, considering, as we'll get into in due course, that it does sort of lend itself towards misery almost from the first day. Ben, it's great to see you. Welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thanks, Zach. I'm a little bit kind of awestruck there by your description. Thank you very much. It's great to be on your show. I'm really looking forward to this and this chat. It's been a while coming, but it should be fun. So thanks.
No, not at all. I mean, we touched base at, what was it, Chalk Valley last year?
That's right, yeah.
And then we sort of been talking on and off ever since. But I tell you what I particularly like about this, and folks, you know me by now. You know that I don't praise when it's not, give praise when it's not due. This was one of those books that was not only really honest to the history, which is obviously going to appeal to a historian who's always kind of worrying about false perceptions and all the rest of it and myth busting, but it managed to do that kind of, retain that kind of historical honesty whilst also just being a ridiculously good read, you know, really emotional as well. There are moments in this where I was sitting back going, this is really sad, or, you know, kind of really being sucked into the drama. So it's compelling, it's emotional, it's brilliantly written. Yeah, people are going to want to buy this. For the context, though, for our listeners who perhaps, particularly if they're sort of Napoleonic in kind of what they read, perhaps they haven't read your novels. I want to start with you on this one. Why, because all of your novels are historical novels, right? Why was it that medium that you decided to work in as opposed to, I don't know, crime or fantasy? And, you know, why take on this rather than being the next Lee Child, for example?
It's quite simply, history has always been one of my favorite things ever since I was a small boy. It's neither of my parents are particularly interested in history, but I was. It's one of those, you know, sometimes you do things that your parents do, you learn from them, and sometimes you just have these interests. I have no idea where it came from. I remember reading Asterix when I was small. You know, that was my first contact with ancient Rome, and I moved on into. I was a huge book reader as a boy. A lot of historical fiction, like Rosemary Sutcliffe's Eagle of the Ninth, and I mean, I was reading sharp novels by the time I was 14. And I read them. I kept up to date with them for many years. I didn't continue that because, like in my 20s, like a lot of people, I fell away from reading. But when I actually trained as a veterinary surgeon, and so I did that for 16 years. And when I was wanting to change careers, it would seem natural to me to want to write a novel. And writing one set in the past, there was no question that it was going to be historical. I literally wouldn't have thought of anything else. And this is my 18th novel, so it was only a matter of time before I started moving time periods a few years ago, and this really screamed at me to be a novel when I was. Do you want to ask another question, or will I keep talking?
You carry on. People are here to listen to you, not me.
Okay, thanks. So I in another one of my sort of fingers in the pie is I actually work as a bike guide on these sort of epic length 1 month, 5 week cycling trips in Europe, where the Hannibal is the first one I did. That was cycling from Barcelona to Rome over the Alps, a la Hannibal. And I give the historical talks. And 4 years ago, I was asked to do the first week of the Napoleon, which was pre-Ukraine war, obviously, was London to Moscow, although actually St. Petersburg, because the roads near Moscow are so dangerous. But it was technically supposed to be to Moscow. And so I read Zamoyski's 1812, is incredible. Adam Zamoyski's book. I hope I pronounced his name correctly, but a British historian who is, I mean, it reads like a thriller. And what was funny was that one of my good friends had actually given me the book about 10 years before when it came out. And I had very young children at the time, and I looked and went, "Oh, this looks great." He says it's great, and I had no time to read it. So, but I didn't give it to the charity shop. It sat there on my bookshelf, screaming to be read. And I finally picked it up and read it before doing this week of guiding. And I just went, "I'm writing a novel about this. This is unbelievable. It is." And then, of course, you know, I realized that there were more than 150 first-hand accounts, and we've got the Charles Britton Austin 1,200-page day-by-day book that I got as well. And I mean, I joke in the author's note, but it is true that this is basically a work of non-fiction with a few fictional characters put into it. It almost wrote itself. It was I can't say a joy to write because it was so horrific, but it was an amazing book to write. And I was really, really glad to have done it.
Yeah, I must say the horror element, not in a sort of gratuitous horror kind of way, but that kind of God, this was awful kind of mood really does come through. And I don't know, we kind of had the conversations about, you know, that's kind of one of the challenges of writing this, is that as a reader, you sort of don't want to be depressed by the whole thing all of the time. But let's talk a little bit about the tale itself. As I say, I read an early manuscript, so I don't know how things have changed over time. You hadn't even written the final chapter, so I still don't know what happens at the end.
Sorry about that.
So I'm going to have to go and get the book and find out for myself.
I will send you a copy for sure.
But for our listeners, you've got a Brit serving Napoleon, but also acting as a spy. There's a gambling addiction thrown into it, a love affair with an actress, a rivalry worthy of, frankly, the duelists. And if that wasn't dramatic enough, as we've said, it's set during the 1812 Russia campaign. So how do you kind of go about balancing all of those different things? Because as I say, you know, you've got to make this a form of entertainment. The history is compelling by itself, but that's not why people are picking up your book. So how do you go about kind of crafting your characters and kind of weaving in your plotline into a narrative as big as the Moscow campaign?
Well, I think the way I could describe it is with a micro focus and a macro focus, and moving between the two. That's the way I try and portray all the books. The history is hopefully speaks for itself and is very dramatic, whether it's Napoleonic or a different time period. But the story, as you mentioned, that's vital. Whether you're reading a romance or a thriller or a crime novel or an historical fiction novel, the story has got to make the reader want to read the next page and the next chapter and to keep going, because otherwise they won't enjoy it. So story is all important, but it's actually quite easy to remain loyal to history. It's something that as your as your listeners may know, you proofread it, looking for mistakes, and kind enough to refer me to a colleague of yours whose specialist period is Russia. So I get academics to read my books. I have done for a number of years, but so he's half French, half British. So I wanted to do that because I'm completely honest here. 70 odd% of my readers in the world are in Britain, so there's got to be an in there. It's not a coincidence that Bernard Cornwell has never written Sharp in Russia, apart from the fact that he was probably somewhere else. But there was no British involvement except when it came to espionage. There was quite a big presence, and there was indeed a British diplomat in the French. He was positioned with the military command of the Russians, and actually wrote stuff that survives. And we know of quite a bit of intelligence that went on, although we don't know many details because it was so secret that no one wrote it down. But there are textbooks on it. So I wanted a character who could be a British agent, but reluctantly. And so there were quite a few royalists who fled the revolution, and some of them no doubt married British people. So there will have been half French, half English people. And then I read a few Flashman books when I was a teenager, and I have to say, and I'm probably upset lots of people, I really didn't like them. I really disliked Flashman because he's such a scumbag, which obviously makes him a great character. But what I wanted in my head, having not looked at a Flashman book for 30 plus years, was to have an anti-hero, because certainly in my earliest novels, the heroes were a bit just too clean cut and good guys, and not as three-dimensional. They didn't have too many failings. And so essentially you've got this man who's a gambling addict, a drunkard, and has never fired a pistol, who ends up in France. I won't say how, but running prisoners of war over the English Channel, which was a massive thing at the time. A wonderful expression that survived from the Guinea boats that were crossing the Channel. They were called that because Napoleon was buying British gold because he didn't have any left. And the smugglers who rowed over the Channel, they could row so fast that none of the sailing ships could catch them. And a customs officer described trying to catch one as like setting cows to catch a hare. So, of course, a quote like that just goes straight into the book. So anyway, he ends up in France, and he's down on his luck in Paris. And then in an homage to a magnificent novelist called Ronald Welch, who wrote, they're young adult, but they're really kind of highbrow young adult books. And he wrote, I don't know if you're familiar with the books. They're about a family called Carey, which is the surname of the hero. So that's a homage to him. And they take place from the First Crusade all the way through history, right up until World War I, with one member of this family for literally generations upon generations. And so he ends up meeting two British secret agents who have the same names as the guy in the Welsh novel, who blackmail him into becoming an imperial messenger. And back in those days, when I checked this with you, I think, on the recommendation, you could just be literally made in imperial staff. You didn't have to serve a career. So he ends up as this messenger because he can ride a horse, and he's fallen for this French actress who's gone off to Moscow, which was a big thing at the time. Indeed, thousands of them ended up trying to flee Moscow with the army. And off he goes, just not knowing what the hell is going on, and not wanting to be shooting anybody. And of course, inevitably he gets put in situations where violence is the only way out, and so he's also crossed this arrogant cavalry officer. And I did think of The Duelists, which is Ridley Scott's first film, based on two French officers who fought more than 30 duels between 1794 and 1818 or something like that. And he fights a number of duels with this guy, and to anticipate the one-star Amazon reviews that would said there's no way this guy would have had 3 or 4 duels with the same guy, I actually have a 2-paragraph note at the front of the book about dueling. So I had great fun reading literally 2 textbooks on dueling, and some of the stuff in that was just gold that didn't get into the book either. But yeah, read a whole book on French theater, and whole book on poor people in France and poor people in England at the time. I'm not just interested in military history. I'm interested in everything about history so that I can try and get it, as much of it, right as I can.
I think you are definitely sort of the historian's author, in a lot of respects.
I'll take that one. Thank you.
Because I mean, genuinely, so I mean, dueling is one of the things that I do a lot of research on, because Crime and Punishment's my thing. And I was reading this going, God, somebody's got it right for once.
Oh, wow.
It's that kind of sense of, rather than sort of what we as 21st century folks might kind of envisage as a duel, all of the little kind of social expectations and the emotions that get tied up in it, and the macho versus the fear, and it's all just so potent within this. One of the things I do want to touch on is that, in addition to the novel's characters, the key protagonists that you've built for this world, you've also got historical figures in there. Napoleon's in there, Caulaincourt's in there. How do you go about bringing those people to life on the page? And is that kind of easier because you've got the history, or does actually the history and the need to be honest to that history kind of something that's a bit of an impediment, and you sometimes look at these things and go, this would be better if I could just kind of make Napoleon do X?
No, I didn't find that, actually. So, although obviously Napoleon was the man, the man pulling the strings and the orchestrator of this campaign, he was a relatively minor character in the book, but he wrote himself, because there are so many descriptions. I mean, I used Caulaincourt's whole book, and literally he said, and I had this conversation with the emperor, and I confirmed it I went and spoke to Duroc the next morning. He confirmed what I'd said. I'm going, there's a man who's actually got a copy editor of his own 200 years ago. Why, in my head, I was just thinking, well, I'm not going to contradict Caulaincourt. He's written down what he said and checked it with a friend of his. So, and just the because Napoleon had a monstrous ego. That was very apparent from the book, from the books, I should say, the text I was reading. Anyone who would sort of decide he was going to do this and then literally realize that it was not a good idea, and being told by Caulaincourt the whole way along, this is not a good idea. The winter, knowing that Alexander had said, not while, I will go to Kamchatka rather than surrender. And all his posturing with saying, if only Alexander would come to me, we can embrace and be like brothers and it'll all be fine, but he just needs to come to me. Oh, well, he's not there. So there are no Russians around. So we'll just keep advancing. So it was quite easy to have the hero think, what the hell is this man thinking? Well, all the troops are still happy, so it must be okay. Troops support a winning general, fans support a winning football team. And so probably most of the soldiers, certainly for a good part of it, they just thought, okay, so the Russians aren't here, but we've beaten everybody else, okay, apart from Spain, obviously. But Austerlitz and Eylau and Wagram and all those, these were the men who had literally conquered Europe. So I tried, it felt very realistic the way Napoleon was described, although they didn't damn him. They obviously adored him, even if they thought he was crazy. Like the scene where Caulaincourt tries to leave him because he won't listen. Napoleon won't listen to him, so he says he's going off to Spain because he couldn't go to France because that would be cowardly. So I'm going to go to Spain and serve there. And he refused to go and meet Napoleon in the morning, and he was avoiding all the messengers so that Napoleon couldn't get him to come to his presence. And eventually, one of the messengers found him and ordered him to the emperor's presence. So he had to go, and it ended up with Napoleon literally doing his thing of grabbing him by the ear and laughing at him. And Caulaincourt wrote in his diary, "What could I do?" So he just stayed. And he knew, he of all people, he really knew what it could be like. So it kind of, those aspects, I hope, wrote themselves because the descriptions that were in the text were so rich.
It is one of the things that I remember, because I didn't know for sure quite what to expect. So I'd read some of your Roman work, but I'm not a Roman specialist. So for that, you can just kind of, certainly I can just kind of read it as well, anybody else who picks up a historical novel, and you just sort of enjoy it for what it is. But it did strike me when I was reading this that there was this kind of air, even in the way that you were writing things, that I could kind of hear elements of the historical accounts and the way in which they were influencing what you were writing. And I'm curious about how you find that sort of defining line between the historical fact and the fiction. Because, for example, Bernard Cornwell has famously said to people, look, I get things wrong sometimes. You just got to deal with it. And I remember sitting down and interviewing Simon Scarrow a while back, and he's kind of, he does his best, but he always kind of comes back to that point of, it's about fun. That's why you're writing fundamentally. So how do you go about defining that line between the two? And I suppose, as a kind of a follow-up question, because you're always going to get people who go, oh, well, what about? How do you then, if you know that you've just kind of massaged things a bit because it needs to in order to flow as a story, how do you then go about dealing with the inevitable people who want to sort of turn around and complain?
So they're known as rivet counters by World War II specialists, as in the number of rivets. You got the number of rivets in the wing of a Spitfire wrong. And yeah, I actually don't mind them anymore because, thanks to academics like yourself and your friend Alexander, and also the amount of research I do, thankfully, I mean, there are going to be mistakes in this book probably, but thankfully the errors I make are pretty small. And I can live with them, because for every one person who reads that, there are 100, hopefully, who read it and just enjoy it. But I just like getting things right, because to me, it's kind of pointless writing an historical fiction novel unless you try and portray it accurately. I don't even like, for example, and I have an analogy for the Napoleonic one, but I'll go to my Roman ones first. I don't even like the way we have to make our Roman protagonists more, what's the word, socially acceptable. I have a friend called Harry Sidebottom, who's a doctor in Roman history and writes novels as well. And as he says, your average Roman male was homophobic, racist, and didn't think anything of wild animals tearing a criminal to pieces in front of him and his wife and kids. But he still loved his dog and he liked his kids, and there are tombstones to Roman dogs, not very many of them, but there are a few. And in the Napoleonic novel, and so sorry, what you kind of have to do to make these characters more likable is just not emphasize that, but they can't be too right on, or they wouldn't be accurate. And what I had to do in that sort of vein with the Napoleonic novel was that as it became grimmer and grimmer during the retreat, there were bits that I just didn't put in. And there were scenes that, I wouldn't even describe them on this podcast because they're just beyond, usually involving civilians and children and women. And also, I ended the book at the Berezina, because after the Berezina, it just got even worse. Like when they got to Vilnius, oh my goodness me, Murat should have been shot for what he did at Vilnius, and or Vilna as it was known.
In fairness, I'm not known on this podcast as being a friend of Murat, so you can indulge in the Murat rant as much as you like.
Yeah, he was, but some of the things he did. He led a couple of charges on the 1812 thing. 60 staff officers against 3,000 Russians, and the Russians ran away. And he nearly got killed one day where he used to drink brandy with the Russians. He'd ride up to them and be chatting to them, and they thought he was great because of the way he dressed and because he was so nuts. And he rode up to this group of Cossacks one day, and one of them, who didn't know who he was, pulled out his pistol and took a shot at him, and the bullet blew his hat off. So literally an inch or two lower and he would have been dead. And apparently he was a lot more cautious about approaching groups of Cossacks after that. So yeah, it was so in the macro, you had all this incredible stuff and the horrific war and battles and suffering and so on. But at the micro, you have the camaraderie and the gambling. You know, it was very deliberate. You can have gambling and that can be funny. And the dueling added another, because, you know, a bit like Hawks, what's he called? Hawkswell or Hawkswell, so the enemy of the Sharp House. Hakeswell. You know, it's a trope, but you've got to have an enemy close to home too. So the guy he's dueling with is like this honorable officer, but his honor has been insulted. So they're fighting each other, but they hardly ever meet because the army's so big. And then he's a gambler and he's got his mates. And you know, I read about this dog in Zamoyski's book that got frostbite in its paws. And so its owner, and it had walked all the way from Spain and Portugal to France to Russia. And this guy put it in his backpack, and we don't know whether it survived. I just went, that dog is going straight into the book. And what's his name? His name's Marshal Ney, because he's in that amazing exploit where they got the road blocked in November at Krasny, and they marched sideways and went across the river. You know all that bit? And there were 12,000 of them, and less than 1,500 made it, but Ney did. And so the dog gets called Marshal Ney, and that dog survives. Like, sorry if that's a spoiler, but the dog makes it. So, you know, I had all these essentially artificial things, but also true, that happened to uplift it. And I just felt, and even with that, my editor still got me. You don't know this because you read the earlier version, but she did actually ask me to leaven the retreat a bit. I ended up taking out about 3,000 words, which is like a long chapter. It was just bits here and there, but it was the length of a long chapter of really grim bits that were just. And I posted the cut sections on Facebook, and all my readers are going, "Oh my goodness, this is so amazing! It's so visceral." I'm going, "Yeah, but it's been cut." "Oh, why has it been cut?" "And your editor, what does she know?" And I said, "Yeah, imagine reading 150 pages of this." And somebody went, "Okay, I think I get what you mean." So,
yeah, it was probably the only significant reservation I had about the whole thing, was that it's just, it's grim, and then it's grim, and inevitably there's that sense of tragic inevitability, right? And actually that runs in a few layers. You know, you set these characters up really nicely to kind of give these inklings about the falls that they're going to experience further down the line, but then also you've got this kind of looming thing of, this is a book about the Moscow campaign, it ain't going to end well for people. One, just to double back ever so slightly, we were talking about sort of acerbic readers. And I've heard some entertaining ones from authors over the years. Simon Scarrow told me once that somebody called him, and I'm quoting directly here, folks, so excuse the profanity, somebody called him a dickhead for describing Wellington as Wesley in the early part of his novels, saying, well, everybody knows that he's Wellesley. And the point is that the person making that comment, and they'd written a letter to him, so, you know, there's effort for you, had missed the point, didn't know their history well enough to know that originally Wellesley is Wesley, and they changed the family name. Do you have any kind of experiences that you are willing to share of people kind of, I don't know, just getting it completely wrong and being total fools?
Yeah, I've got a couple. So I've walked Hadrian's Wall twice in full Roman gear, including the mail and the hobnail. I wore hobnail boots, which were an accurate reconstruction of a pair, not the hobnail sandals. My friend wore them, but I often, if I'm promoting a Roman book, I will actually stand in a Waterstones in full Roman gear, because people look at you and then they come up and they start talking to them. And I was standing in Waterstones Carlisle a few years ago, and this guy walked up and he literally tapped me in the chest, and I was wearing a male shirt, and he tapped me in the chest and said, why are you wearing those? The Romans never wore chainmail. And my mouth just fell open and explained to him very politely that, yeah, they did. And it was around from the 3rd century BC and they copied it from the Gauls. And he took it in fairness and he walked away. And then by email, so here's one which, people could agree. I once wrote about a needle in a haystack. And I always look up the first described incident, the first incidents in recorded writing of a saying, and it's only from the 1400s for a needle in a haystack. But I didn't have to look up hay to know that hay is thousands of years old, and I did look up needle, and there are needles from the Bronze Age. So, all right, the description only survives from the 1400s, but hay and needles have been around for a very long time. So I put that in a novel. And about a year later, I did get an email telling me that I'd got it wrong and so on and so on. I just wrote back with the links to 2 websites for the origins of hay and the origins of needles. And, if they get that excited about things, then for me, it's the whole thing is artificial, because no matter how hard I try, unless I write all my French characters in French and my Roman characters in Latin, so many words, for example, in the English language have French origins. So in a Roman novel, you shouldn't use any of them. For example, I don't use the words reconnaissance ever in a Roman novel because it sounds too French, quote unquote. But so where do you draw the line? It's all a construct. And so you're going to annoy people with different things that you do. And all I can do is try to portray the period I'm writing about as accurately as possible. And if I've done that and the reader thinks in their head that they were in Russia in 1812, and someone like yourself can go, right, great, I got the feel of the period, no screaming errors there, then I've done my job. But there'll always be naysayers. But I'm a naysayer too. So if I'm proofreading a novel for a quote at the moment, and I won't give any details about the time period, but it is some hundreds of years in the past, and it's been optioned for Netflix, okay, and it's a great idea. I'm reading it going, I wish I'd had this idea myself, but it's set hundreds of years ago, and these villagers go for a hike on page 1, like 500 years ago, people hiking, and that's just screaming at me. Nobody hiked back then. So I wrote to the editor going, this is amazing, but like this. Anyway, but most people might not notice that. So does it really matter? Probably not. I don't know.
I mean, in an age where everybody had to walk places, unless you were incredibly rich and could own a horse, the idea that you would voluntarily just go for a walk when, if you need to go anywhere, you're basically going through countryside anyhow. I think people often forget, how much urbanization has happened in the last century, to the point where you go back 150 years and actually you're walking through countryside.
We units of time. I mean, originally in my first few Roman novels, I'd refer to hours. I think I'd probably referred to half hours and maybe quarter hours. Oh my goodness, I don't do that anymore. Nobody thought like that. They thought it's dawn, maybe it's nearly midday, and sunsets in a few hours. They had no concept of shorter periods than that. And the Viking novel I'm writing another one, thanks to a wonderful text by a monk, because they were the people who wrote things down in the 700s and 800s. I found out that in medieval Ireland, early medieval Ireland, which is where the novel is set, there were no measures of distance greater than a spear cast. So you have something for an inch and 3 inches, 6 inches, a foot, 3 foot, 10 feet, whatever, which is like what you can see and the size of your field. And then spear cast is the longest recorded measurement of distance. And so I already had miles in there. Out they came, and someone goes, well, it's 5 spear casts. And after that, I don't know how long it's going to take us, maybe half the day. And that was just a really small detail, but that was the kind of thing that really feeds me, because I'm going, almost nobody will notice that, but it is accurate to put that in.
If anything, people are going to read it and go, why's he stuck that in? I don't understand. What's a spear cast, But that's the fun of it.
I hadn't thought of that. I'd be like, why didn't he write bigger distances? Doesn't he know?
For
Yeah.
God's sake, what's the matter with this Kane guy?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, one of the frustrations that historians often have is sort of trying to deal with the fact that people can't separate the fact from the fiction. And it's really interesting to talk to somebody like yourself who is so focused on, yes, I'm going to write something that people are going to find fun, but I'm also going to ground this utterly in the historical reality and sort of fact checked everything. And the counter side is that, you know, somebody can, like me, can sit here and read a book, whatever it might be, and we can nitpick to the end of time. We've done it with Waterloo, the 1970 film. But I was on a show recently and somebody made a really good point that sometimes you just need to suspend your disbelief. That's part of it. So when this Napoleon film comes out, then, you know, am I going to sit there and pick the holes in it? Well, I might sort of suck my teeth occasionally, but basically I'm going there to have fun. But that becomes difficult when people take it as fact. And the anecdote that I always use for this is having been to the Rifles Museum in Winchester in my late teens. So by this point, I was a bit precocious and I was starting to pick up some hefty history books. And I'm in the gallery that's dedicated to the Peninsular War and Waterloo section. And a guy walks in, and back then they had this kind of shooting range style setup where they had a Baker rifle and you could have a go at kind of shooting French skirmishers and all the rest of it. And this guy wanders in, walks up to the this shooting range style thing, picks up the rifle, goes, yeah, it's sharp, innit? Puts the rifle down, walks out of the gallery. And that was his sole engagement. And it's kind of that thing of how do people like me and people like you find a way of working together to address this sort of tendency of, I read it in a book, therefore it's true, or I saw it on TV, therefore it's true, and not necessarily just being that little bit more careful about digging a bit deeper?
Oh my goodness. What a question. I don't know. It's a very good question. I think I know a lot of historical novelists because I'm part of an association, the Historical Writers Association, and you know, I know all my compatriots like Harry Sidebottom and Simon Scarrow and so on, and pretty much everybody who I've ever sat in a pub with or had a meal with and walked Hadrian's Wall with, they're really, really into the history and want to describe it as accurately as possible. So I'm not going to say gatekeepers because historians ought to be the gatekeepers in a way, but I think, and maybe in a fashion, you know, historical novelists are, because the ones I know, which is the vast majority, they're really meticulous about their research. You know, to the nerd, it's probably nerdish the way I am about it, but that's how I find most people. I mean, is it a lady called Elizabeth Chadwick who writes books set in the 12th century, and when I was breaking into that with my Lionheart series, I've read a few of her books and they're great. And I went on her website and she publishes her bibliography. Now she's been writing them for 20 plus years. So she'd written even more books than I had about the Roman period. And I think there were something like 300 textbooks on her bibliography. And I literally cried. There were actually tears in my eyes when because I had 3 months to read enough research to write a book about Richard the Lionheart. And I was going, how can I do this? I've spent 15 years reading. I have 300 textbooks plus about ancient Rome. How can I do that with Richard the Lionheart? And then obviously Napoleonic. And the simple answer is I can't. But history is vitally important. But how do we get it across? I don't know. I think one of the things that I don't know how much experience you have. You probably maybe have more experience with film crews or film programs or documentaries being made, but certainly the limited amount I know, and this is generally to do with Roman period dramas, are they'll get an historian on board and reenactors on board, and they listen to what they say, and then they just go, oh, we don't like that. We don't like that's what their uniform is, so we're going to dress them with these, like this. And I know a reenactor who got fired off the set of a film which was being made in Britain because he wouldn't shut up about the crap uniforms and the incorrect uniforms that he was going, what I'm wearing is correct. What they're wearing is not correct. And they eventually just sacked him. And he said he was glad because at least his name didn't get listed on the credits. But I don't know. So it can be done. The series Barbarians on Netflix, which is about the Varian disaster in '89. For anyone who doesn't know, 3 Roman legions wiped out by German tribes in ambush, and it's exciting. It's not very accurate, but what is accurate is the Roman uniforms, and the reason for that is the military advisor is a Polish guy called Cezar, and I can't pronounce his surname because there are too many Z's and Y's and S's in it. But he's a lovely guy. I know him, and he has a huge reenactment unit, nearly 100 legionaries, and they're all in their 20s, and they're not fat, and their equipment is meticulously accurate. I mean, he has literally changed the thinking on centurions' helmets, which traditionally they always thought the transverse crest was horsehair, and he's gone around taking thousands of photographs, close-ups of statues and so on, and just gone, no, look, you can see their feathers. So his hat now has feathers, and all the reenactors around the world are copying him. And anyway, he was employed by Netflix as the military advisor for the Romans, and so I had a conversation with him. He wouldn't back down. He was just like, if you want me, you're going to do them properly. And so the Roman soldiers are actually accurate, not the German tribesmen, but so that doesn't really answer your question. I don't know, because I think that generally filmmakers will listen to historians until they don't want to listen to them.
See, you say that. I have known documentaries to be like, yeah, so we're going to spin this line, and then you sort of have to have a quiet word with them and go, no, that what you're saying there is just historical nonsense. And they're like, yeah, but we can make it work this way. And you're sort of going, no, it really doesn't hold water at all. And these are documentary producers, and actually it's moments like that you start to realize how much of a gulf there is between what the public even get fed in a documentary, let alone something on whether it's a drama or a film. I just want to stay with the whole kind of screen thing. What's your views on, is being too focused on the facts actually a disadvantage for you as an author? Obviously, what a lot of folks won't know from the world of showbiz is that hundreds, if not thousands, of ideas get mooted, and very, very small proportion ever actually get made. But do you find that actually, because you are one of those people who works really hard to get the facts right, that ends up being a disadvantage? Because when Hollywood comes knocking, Hollywood wants Hollywood and nothing else.
Well, I've never had the sort of really big discussions with Hollywood or TV. There have been some expressions of interest in a few of my books, but we were just briefly touching on this before the recording started. So I'll just go sci-fi and say Ready Player One. Most people know that film, but based on the sci-fi novel. Something like that is so original that when Hollywood wants to make it, they have to buy it from the author, because otherwise, they will lose in a court case. But I personally think, and I don't know whether this is true, but I personally think that because my novels are all closely based on historical fact, that, for example, that Barbarians series, I've written a trilogy on that, and there was some interest from one of the TV companies making a similar program, but the minute I mentioned optioning my books, they just disappeared. So I think.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month slows. Full terms at mintmobile.com.
Even on a budget, quality is non-negotiable. That's why Quince is the place to score high-end essentials at 50 to 80% less than similar brands. Get your hands on buttery soft cashmere sweaters from just $60, Italian leather jackets, and so much more. And the best part about Quince, they exclusively partner with factories committed to safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing. Elevate your style without the elevated price tag with Quince. Go to quince.com/upgrade for free shipping and 365-day returns.
Well, I'm not going to name any names, but big companies often look at ideas and go and use them if they feel like it. And I know I have a friend this happened to with one of his novels, and he consulted a media lawyer and was basically told that the lawyers that the TV company would have would be a lot bigger and have bigger guns than he did. So did he really want to tangle with them? And he decided not to. So yeah, it's not an impediment. I mean, if I had to choose between, I can play fast and loose with the facts and Hollywood will come knocking on my door, or will I stick to the history? I'm going to stick to the history, because it would sicken me to see one of my novels on the screen and it was completely ruined. I say that, and I'm going to quote Louis de Bernières, who wrote Captain Corelli's Mandolin, and famously that film was a turkey. The book was brilliant and the film was a turkey. And I always remember reading an interview with him where the interviewer said, well, the film Captain Corelli's Mandolin, it wasn't very good, really. And Louis de Bernières' answer was, mate, before that film, I lived in a one-bedroom flat in Streatham above a butcher's. Afterwards, I bought a 4-bedroom house in Suffolk and I learned to play the violin for 3 years. So, I don't know. I don't want to change history. I really like trying to get it accurate. And there are things that irritate me about my earlier novels that I got wrong. Even in my first trilogy, I put in a few Hollywoodisms that I knew were incorrect, like thumbs down for the death gesture in a gladiator arena. And I knew it was wrong. And I said it to my agent at the time. Oh, it doesn't matter, mate. That's what they think Hollywood loves. Put it in anyway. I would never do that now. So, yeah.
So are there any no-go areas when you're writing? Do you look at certain events particularly, I guess, and think, what, I just can't include that? Or are there any topics that you wouldn't go near because it's too much of a minefield, or that you just feel aren't going to tap into what people are looking for when it comes to your books?
Yeah, there are two-part answer to that. I do always have it in mind, the market. I'm a full-time novelist, which is actually quite rare. Just your listeners may not realize, but for every 7 novelists whose books you see in a Waterstones or Tesco or W.H. Smith, whatever, only 1 out of those 7 is a full-time novelist. The other 6 have another job. So I'm luckily one of those 1 in 7. So it's a bit like a band. Each book has to do well. Each album has to do well. You're only as good as your last book. Not quite. I do 3-4 book contracts, but I've got to be mindful of the period I write about. So, but fortunately, history is so rich that that's not a problem. But yes, there are things I steer away from. There are things that I put in I was thinking about it today, actually, the Spartacus book. There are things that I put in that I kind of wish I hadn't. And there are definitely things in this 1812 book I didn't put in. There was a part of the Battle of Smolensk, which was this incredibly stupid attack on a walled city that Napoleon's cannon weren't powerful enough to pound through because the walls were about 15 feet thick. And he'd left all his big cannon behind. And so they lobbed a load of flare shells over the walls and everything was wooden. So the city just burnt to the ground really quickly and many hundreds of people burnt to death. And the scene when they went in the following morning it was literally all verbatim descriptions by these French officers. So it was, and my editor, there was one bit she actually asked me to take it out, and because she said none of it's gratuitous, but that feels like it is. And I kind of went, okay. And then that was the only bit before the retreat. But then during the retreat, yeah, there was actually quite a lot I didn't put in. I just found the difference between when that Spartacus book came out was I had tiny children then. Now my son is nearly 17 and my daughter's 14. And, you see eyes differently when you're a parent and as your kids grow up. And these scenes of, there were children with women and, they were, when you're starving to death and the Russians are circling and you're going to die if you don't look after yourself. I mean, the first people to die are the non-combatants. So the scenes that were described by these French officers were just horrific. And I sort of alluded to it a bit, but I didn't go into it in depth. And even at the Berezina, there were bits of that I didn't put in either, because it was just, yeah, I read them and I think they'll probably be in my mind until the day I die, actually, because they're just unspeakable. But obviously I didn't want to censor it too much, because then it wouldn't be realistic enough. We refused to sugarcoat it. So it was interesting when that you came to me when you read it and said, I am concerned about how grim it is, and that had been my main concern when I sent it to you. So hopefully I got it right, that there's just enough light and just enough humor, and black humor as well, because when you're in a desperate situation, you joke about everything. So an example is on the way through Poland and Lithuania, when it rained or there was sleet, you look for shelter, and so all the peasants had fled. So the French soldiers would rush into these peasant houses and they'd bar the door because they didn't want anyone coming in. And then they'd put as much wood in the stove as they could, and they didn't realize the stove just went straight up through the thatch. So they'd set the thatch on fire, and then they couldn't get out. And initially, all their comrades would be helping them and trying to get them out, and so on and so on. And then during the retreat, this was happening, but it was cold now. And so that what often happened was other men would just strip the thatch off the roof, because then they could give it to their horses to eat and use it as a blanket. So you'd end up in a house with no roof. But if that didn't happen, you'd also set the roof on fire because you were trying to keep warm, and you'd have barred the door to stop everyone coming in. And all the guys used to stand around with their hands out to the fire, going, listening to the screams of their comrades and the pop, pop, pop of their cartridges going off inside, going, oh, isn't that terrible? And then a couple of weeks later, it was happening, and they were laughing at their comrades dying inside while they held their hands out to warm themselves at the fire. And it was just this step-by-step degradation, and this one officer's description, which again, I think got into the book, where he wrote how his humanity was just stripped away day by day, until he would literally walk over a comrade, because if you stopped to help him up off the ground, you would also die. And it was incredible, actually, just really stark. But like I say, I hope I weaved in enough nobility and saving a dog. I know, it's artificial, but that dog is real. Someone did put a dog in his backpack, and so on. So yeah.
But I do think it's that honesty that is what really impressed me. You think Napoleon, the Russia campaign, and there's always going to be that temptation to play to the crowd of Napoleonic glory. Obviously, the Moscow campaign is one of those examples where there's as little glory as Napoleon's ever able to take away from anything. It's as bad as it really gets. And yet, you didn't kind of go down that route of let's make this a novel about Napoleon, and it's all great, and then things sort of unfortunately go wrong, but we're not going to focus on too much of the suffering. We're just going to make sure that people are aware. You focus on, this is a kind of a bottom-up novel in a lot of respects. It's about the human elements in there. I guess as we start to sort of look at wrapping this one up, there are a couple of areas that I want to talk about. And one is about advice that you'd give to people who are looking to write historical fiction, because everybody thinks that they can write a novel. And I'm one of those people who really doesn't think that they can write a novel, actually.
Okay.
If anybody came knocking, I'd tell them to go away, because my abilities in that vein are pathetic. But what advice would you give to people who are kind of thinking about, perhaps exploring that avenue?
The first advice I always give is, because I get, conversation in a bar, someone invites you around for dinner, and you meet someone you don't know. Oh, you write. Oh, I've got an idea for a novel, and I always say, okay, so how much have you written? And generally the answer is, oh, I haven't started yet. I'm too busy. And I literally mime holding a smartphone in my hand and scrolling my thumb. and I say to people, everybody's got time to do this for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour a day. It could easily be more than an hour a day. So if you want to write a novel, you have to take it seriously. You can't drive a car if you've never had lessons. So start writing and write every day. Oh, I don't have time every day. And so I challenged one reader. I've done this a few times. I challenged one reader. I said, blokes often take quite a long time sitting on the loo. So I said, instead of being on your smartphone, I said, bring your laptop in and get it. If you have an old laptop, and I challenge you to write on the toilet, because he had small kids, so he had no time. So he came back to me about a year later, and he'd written about 25,000 words sitting on the loo. So, everyone can find 10 minutes a day or 15 minutes a day. So start doing that. Do that for 1 month, 3 months, and suddenly you've actually got something. So it's actually really important to start and make it a habit, like stopping smoking or stopping drinking alcohol or taking up an exercise, running or swimming or whatever. And then read everything, not just your own genre, but everything, and try and learn and look online for resources on how to write. And writing courses, great, but you need to practice writing for, I would say, at least 1 to 2 years before you think of publishing. Because if you do it sooner than that, I'm sorry, but unless you're Sebastian Faulks or someone like that, it's not going to be good enough. And another critical one is whenever your novel is finished is, a lot of people get their family and friends to read it, which is fine, but your family and friends love you. And so they're not good critics. You need to pay a professional editor to read it and edit it and pay them good money. And they will give you, the most incredible tips. I did that with my first novel before it went out to publishers. And it cost me in 2007, it cost 1,200 quid. It was about 20 or 30 hours at about £40 an hour. No, it's more than that. 30 hours at £40 an hour, which back then was an awful lot. It's probably a lot more now, but that was a lot of money, out of my taxed income. But it was pure gold, the notes she gave me, that I would still use stuff that she was able to show me. And often it's literally like just pulling aside a net curtain. So you've got a scene in sort of focus, maybe some of it's in really good focus. You're really good at describing people's emotions or a scene, but other parts are out of focus, and someone pulls aside the net curtain, which is what the editor does, and you go, oh, that's what it looks like. And there's a lot of writing that is just learning, and it does take time, but being persistent and not giving up is also something I say to people. Just because you've been told it's no good doesn't mean it's true. Famously, J.K. Rowling sent her novel to an agent who didn't do children's fiction, and he threw it in the bin, and his secretary pulled it out of the bin because she liked the cover image, which you're not supposed to put on, but she had. And the secretary read it and went, "This is really good, read this." And he rewarded his secretary with £1 million bonus about 2 years later. Now that agent has had probably like 100 million or whatever, but that's a true story. Like, that is not made up. And so, J.K. Rowling might never have found a publisher if it hadn't been for that secretary. So
what's next for you as well? And when I say that, kind of don't spoil the ending of the book that's coming out today. Today is publication day when this airs. So, don't kind of tell us whether there's a direct sequel in the pipeline involving the same characters. But are you going to come back to the Napoleonic era? You talked about you're doing some stuff on the Viking period, I think you said.
yeah.
What's the plan going forwards? What can we look forward to?
Yeah, there's some quite exciting stuff. I wrote the Second Punic War and never finished it, which I get a lot of jip about from readers, a lot actually. And it was genuinely a financial decision because the second and third books didn't sell as well as the first, and my editor suggested heavily that I didn't continue it. And I was literally, do I go back to being a vet and sink my own career, or do I just listen to them? And so I did. But I'm writing this novel set in Norse Ireland, which has been fascinating because, as your listeners, I keep saying readers, sorry, as your listeners may realize, I'm Irish, and so actually, I nearly wrote a Viking novel rather than Roman, but Bernard Cornwell's first Uhtred novel came out when I was thinking of doing Vikings. And I thought that I couldn't then do Vikings, which was actually incorrect, but I went Romans. And finally, I'm going to do Vikings, or more correctly known as Norse. And one of the fascinating things about that very quickly is how different the situation was in Ireland compared to Britain. So obviously people know about Jorvik and they know about Alfred of Wessex and all that, these kingdoms in the west with the English and the Welsh against the Vikings in the east and the north. Totally different in Ireland. There were these few Viking settlements and there were waves of Vikings, and they rapidly married the Irish. And so by the 950s, you had Norse, Hiberno-Norse, and guys coming in from Orkney and guys coming in from the Isle of Man who were Vikings, and you had wars between all these provincial kings in Ireland with Vikings/Norse on both sides for well over 150 years. It really was very different, and so I'm having great fun with that, trying to portray the differences between the two cultures. So I'm going to do two of those, the second of which will culminate with the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, which putatively is when the Vikings were driven out of Ireland, but is actually not true because the bloke in charge of Dublin stayed there for another 20 years. But anyway, it's a good headline. And then I'm going to finish my Hannibal series that I just mentioned. I'm going to do two more on those leading up to the Battle of Zama in 202 BC, sorry. And after that, I may well do another Napoleonic novel, actually, because what happened in 1813 and 1814 leading to 1815, I mean, I'm probably going to inflame some of your readers now, but I'm going to put it out there. If Napoleon had had 140,000 horses that he had lost in Russia and 350 to 450,000 crack soldiers that died, if he'd had them in 1813 and 14, the history of Europe, in my opinion, would be very different indeed. So,
I mean, we've just come off the back of a what if episode, and the whole what if Napoleon doesn't do the whole 1812 campaign is a fascinating thing in itself. Even if we did acknowledge that for Napoleon to not embark on the 1812 campaign would require Napoleon to not be Napoleon.
Yes, indeed.
Which is kind of the problem.
Yeah.
So one final one for me. I mean, I've talked a lot about how much I enjoyed this. The proof of these things is always in the reading. I wonder if you could just give us an extract from the book in order to just kind of give the listeners a sense of quite why this is one of those books that you do need to go and buy, because it's not your sort of, as we've emphasized, it's not sort of glory and, oh, it's all jolly hockey sticks and it's all going to work out neatly in the end. This is a book that gives you the sort of gritty, distressing, emotional reality, whilst also kind of rattling along a hell of a pace and being quite funny along the way. I was reading this going up and down on a train to the National Archives, and people gave me some real looks like, what is this weirdo doing? As I'm sitting in a corridor because the train's overcrowded, chuckling to myself, reading this script.
As in, do you want me to read an extract?
That'd be amazing if you're willing.
Okay, yeah. I'm just, I actually unusually happen to have a copy of the manuscript in front of me. I wouldn't normally, because the book's, it's done now. So I'm just wondering, because you liked the dueling scenes, is that, but that's not showing the grimness maybe enough.
Oh, that's all right. I think people can buy the book in order to enjoy the grimness. But yes, just something that you particularly like or that makes you chuckle.
Yeah. Okay. I'll read you a section from the first dueling scene, because I took. It was funny. I know Paris sort of, not well, but I know I've been there quite a few times, and I thought to myself, oh, the Bois de Boulogne, it's this massive woods really close to the center of Paris. I thought that's going to be a great place for a duel. Put it into Google. Bing, it's where they used to have the duels. It's where people used to go. So, okay. So basically what's happened is that the hero's name is Matthew Carey. Carey is also a common enough surname in Somerset where I live, but it is a French name too. I don't think they're linked, and it's an homage to the Ronald Welsh author I mentioned. So he has insulted this cavalry officer at the theater and been treated really badly, and his temper just frays. He's not normally a fighter, but he slaps the guy across the cheek, which of course is the challenge to a duel, and won't back down. And then he is going to back down, but doesn't. So he's got a duel early in the morning in the Bois de Boulogne, and he didn't even have a pistol. So his friend has literally had to get a pistol for him. So I'll start sort of in the Bois de Boulogne. We had arranged to meet at 7:15, but Guillaume was already waiting at the entrance to the gardens. My heart lifted a little. I was able to return his smile with a weak one of my own. As we began walking westward, I noted the cloth-wrapped bundle in his hands. The pistol? I asked. Yes. I said nothing else. I did not want to see it until I had to. We took the most direct route to the Bois de Boulogne along the Champs-Élysées. In normal circumstances, I would have stared at the unfinished, magnificent Arc de Triomphe, Napoleon's monument to celebrate his victory at Austerlitz. Today, I walked by without even looking at it. I had visited the Bois de Boulogne several times with the Duponts. A former royal park, it was popular with Parisians for Sunday walks. I wished that were my purpose now. Trees spread out to our left and right. There were early blossoms on the cherry trees, and in the distance, between the beeches and oaks, I could see the former hunting lodge of Pavillon d'Armenonville. Birds were singing, welcoming the new day. More peaceful a scene I could not have pictured. This way, said Guillaume, taking a path that went left among the trees. Have you been to a duel before? I asked nervously. Mon Dieu, no, but everyone knows where they're fought. It made sense. I had never been to the spot in Hyde Park where men duelled and bled and died, but I knew its location. Guillaume sensed my mood and made no attempt to draw me into conversation. At length we came to an enormous grassy clearing. Perhaps 150 paces away, two figures were visible. What time is it? I asked. Guillaume consulted his pocket watch. 10 minutes to 8. There was no point in delay, I thought, my nerves tightening. Show me the pistol. He knelt and unwrapped the cloth, revealing a dueling pistol with a plain wooden butt and brass-plated barrel, a small leather bag, and a powder flask. There were also several tiny squares of cloth, wadding to go round the ball. It is not expensive, he said, but it's a good quality weapon. I will load it. That is your job, I know, but I must do it. I have to. I had done it once before. Aiming the barrel end at the sky, I pulled the tip off the end of the powder flask. How many grains? About 30. I made a rough count as they fell, then set down the flask. Guillaume had already taken a ball from the leather bag. I wrapped it in a cloth square, then shoved the lot into the end of the barrel. Pulling the ramrod out, I pushed ball and wadding down as far as they would go. I glanced at Guillaume, flask at the ready. And in the pan? A shrug. Half cover it, he said. Pan filled, I gently brought the steel back down to protect it. Happy? As I can be. Guillaume's kindly face was troubled. Perhaps it is not too late. You could try apologizing to Ferraud. I could, I admitted. The truth was, I regretted my behavior the previous day. If I had just taken the humiliation, I would still be in my bed, rather than facing death in the Bois de Boulogne. Let us see what mood he is in. If it seems possible, you can ask. To look less confrontational, I gave the pistol back to Guillaume, who held it balanced in the crook of his left elbow. We walked at a measured pace towards Ferraud and his second, leaving a trail of shoe-shaped impressions in the dewy grass. My mouth was dry, fear mounting, but I kept my face impassive. Whatever Ferraud might think of my apology, he must not see that I was afraid. Ferraud's second came forward. He was a thin-faced type with bad teeth. Guillaume went to meet him, as was the custom. I am Bachasson, he said politely enough. That is Dupont, and you are... Bardin. What distance is agreeable? 20 paces? This was standard. My friend was wondering if Captain Ferraud would accept an apology. A surprised sniff. A glance at Ferraud, who was staring off in the opposite direction as if he had no interest in the proceedings. I can ask. He did not sound hopeful. Off he went, and Guillaume shot me a look. He did not think Bachasson would be successful either. 25 to 1, I thought at the least. A few moments later, Bachasson returned. Captain Ferraud refuses. Any such attempt should have been made before this morning's meetings, as Monsieur Dupont ought to know. He is aware. I see. Another sniff, one that intimated Bachasson thought I was stupid, or a coward, or both. As I say, Captain Ferraud will not consider an apology. Shots must be fired for honour to be restored. My stomach did a neat and unpleasant roll. Very well, said Guillaume. 20 paces it is. First blood will be sufficient for my principle. This meant the duel could end if a man was wounded, rather than have to continue until one participant was dead. That is also acceptable. How many shots each? Asked Guillaume. 2 was the norm. I felt sick to think of having to stand not just once, but twice, while my enemy took aim and fired at me. Captain Ferraud says he only needs 1, Bachasson declared. Guillaume agreed, and I tried to wipe my sweaty palms on my trousers without being obvious. I had no idea if I would even be able to shoot at Ferraud, vile human being though he was. He, on the other hand, seemed fully prepared to kill me. Can the participants advance before they shoot? Asked Bachasson. We had talked of this. No, said Guillaume. He and Bachasson walked to Ferraud, who had taken off his coat and armed himself from a wooden box lying close by on the grass. He took up a position side on to me, pistol held down by his right side. Guillaume and Bachasson paced in my direction, both counting out loud. Reaching 20, a short distance from me, they both beckoned. I walked, the little devil in my head, gleefully announcing that these were perhaps the last steps I would ever take. Shut up, I snarled at it. To my relief, the voice vanished. Guillaume proffered the pistol and said, Turn sideways. I obeyed. When I let my handkerchief fall, said Bachasson, you may both shoot. Understand? My yes came out as a croak, so dry was my throat. My heart was racing as if I had drunk 6 cups of strong coffee. Breathe, I told myself. Breathe. Guillaume touched my shoulder and went with Bachasson to the halfway point between me and Ferraud. They stood well back, but near enough that we would both be able to see the handkerchief. You may raise your pistols and cock. Carefully, I drew back the curved metal that held the flint. I lifted my arm and pointed the pistol at Ferraud, staring down its barrel at his smug, moustached face. Bachasson's handkerchief was a little white square on the left side of my vision. Ferraud filled its center. His weapon appeared to be aimed at my heart. How bad would the pain be, I wondered? Would I feel the lead ball rip into my flesh, tearing blood vessels, shattering bone, or would I just fall to the turf, severely wounded? No surgeon was present. I did not know one, and Ferraud had not offered to bring one. Probably, I thought, because he expected to emerge unscathed. Ready? Called Bachasson. Yes, we chorused. And I'll stop there, because that leaves everybody on a cliffhanger. Sorry.
Yeah, you don't want to tell people what comes next, do you?
No.
But yeah, it's just great to hear sort of the little details woven in there. Folks, Napoleon's Spy, it's available everywhere. You're going to want to order it. It's out today, the day that this goes out, so 25th of May. Enjoy it, because it's one of those rare things. It's a history book that both myself and Alex Mukaberidze read, and my listeners know Alex Mukaberidze's pedigree, and he was, so I hear, he liked it as well. So
he did. The thing that I'm going to take is one criticism. Sorry to interrupt. Is one criticism which I take as I love, is he said no one man could have seen as many things as my hero did, because obviously I took all the best bits that I read in these first-hand accounts, and I said, I know, but what am I going to do? So because he knew where they all came from. He literally said he could see, he knew which account I was using in each scene, because it's his period. But yeah, it was, I took that as praise.
Too right. People, go and get this. Napoleon's Spy, available everywhere. Ben, it's been fantastic talking to you. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you, Zach. Really enjoyable, great fun, and some great questions. Thank you, and I hope your listeners enjoy it.
Folks, if you're new here, remember to hit the subscribe button so that you can find your way back.
If you're a fan of the period, did you know that you can immerse yourself in a Napoleonic Wars pod universe full of exclusive bonus episodes, a Discord server to chat with the wider Napoleonic enthusiast community? They're a fun bunch, trust me. Plus there are socials, the chance to request episodes, and even a course on the period. Head over to patreon.com, the link's in the description, to find out more. Much love to all my Patreon supporters. Bear in mind that if you want to enjoy the perks of a specific tier, like joining the course, but don't fancy others within a particular tier, you can now edit your pledge to secure individual perks rather than a whole package. Drop me a message via Patreon or Twitter for more details. Shout outs to my mentioned in Dispatches patrons: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, John Haynes, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Lucy Tatner, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Alexandra Leon, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Coulson, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Ed Koss, Indiana Fats, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meeking, Mark Anscombe, Bruins Girl, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Rachel Stark, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbow, Andrew Wright, Graham Spicer, Keys Bishop, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, Sam Gurman, Marcus Cribb, Robin Brasher, Hospitaller, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Roger O'Donnell, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, David Milinski, Stephen Gillen, Richard Anderson, Andrew McCall, Arthur Forgy, and the inimitably named Reto the Sci-Fi Fan. The Admirals, that's David Priest, Rob Coughlin, Graham Callister, Mark Duckers, Michael Guest, John Haynes, Kate Walcombe, and Steve Carter. The Marshalls, that's Ger Brown, Rory Muir, Bob Burnham, Matt Bone, Colin Zimmerman, Ryan Diamond, Stephen Ashworth, and Sean Sullivan. The Emperors, Graham Swidenbank and J.C. Kaiser. And the Legion de Scholars, Dan Hazelwood, David Maxwell, Liam Telfer, and Todd and Laird Campbell. I'll be back very soon, but until then, I'm Zach White. This has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe. And as always, thank you for listening.
Step onto the legendary clay courts of Roland Garros, where the world's best players battle it out at the French Open for a chance to win a Grand Slam title. Tennis Channel Plus is your place to watch. Stream every court from your phone or smart TV live in HD. See the action unfold as legends fight for glory and new rivalries emerge. Daily live coverage begins Monday, May 20th, with match replays on demand so you never miss a moment. From the first serve to the final point, Roland Garros promises unforgettable moments and new chapters in tennis history. Stream now with Tennis Channel Plus to be there when it happens.
Are you ready for truly hydrated skin? Meet Hyaluronic Body Serum, a breakthrough in body care from Osea. It's clinically proven to instantly increase hydration by 161%. Their lightweight, fast-absorbing serum delivers 24 hours of nonstop hydration for silky smooth skin without the sticky afterfeel. Osea's latest innovation combines the magic of their best-selling Hyaluronic Sea Serum with a new formula that's good for the whole body and 5 types of hyaluronic acid to target every layer of the skin. Osea is a women-founded, women-led brand that's been crafting seaweed-powered products for nearly 30 years. The best part? Everything Osea makes is clean, vegan, cruelty-free, and climate-neutral certified, so you never have to choose between your values and your best skin. Treat your skin to clean, vegan skincare from Osea. Get 10% off your first order site-wide with code SUMMER at OseaMalibu.com. That's OSEAMalibu.com, code SUMMER.